Great. So I'm more of a maker and a doer. I'm less of a theorist. I'm not an economist. I'm a designer by trade. And I help build institutions. And when Shine invited me over to speak here, I was researching about Perth a little bit. And I said, let me look at the stories that I have encountered in the last few years from all the different consulting projects and all the different interesting research activity that we do at CID, and see how that sort of contextualizes itself in a location like Western Australia. So today I want to present to you 4 innovation dichotomies for this zone, because I don't have answers here and I don't even have questions. All I have is interesting paradoxes and dichotomies which I think we should debate. So let's start off with 3M. I'm sure all of you know of this. So what comes to your mind when you hear about 3M? What's the most spontaneous first reaction? Post-its? Yeah? Scotch tape? These are the 2 epic products that come out of 3M. Yeah? But how many of you considered what 3M really stands for? So today we know 3M as a company that's innovation-led, that's material sciences driven, is all about novel applications. It's kind of this amazing universe of hundreds and thousands of products that touch our lives in so many different ways, from car shampoos to Scotch tape to whatnot, to specialty fabrics for wound and healthcare. But the interesting story here is almost a century old, and 3M stands for the Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing Corporation. Yeah? This is what it was almost a century ago. And look at what it is today. So what was this journey that went on from mining and minerals to amazing innovations and products that are global and have touched all our lives in so many different ways? This is value creation in a very different sense. And you could say this is a bunch of coincidences or series of things that happen along the way. There's one important driver behind this. When 3M started mining, they blundered in so many ways. They thought they bought into a mineral that didn't exist. They made some crucial mistakes. They consolidated themselves, moved along, and created a range of products. And their original ambition was mining, and they ended into making sandpaper, and they invented the first waterproof sandpaper. Yeah? And this 100-year legacy today has moved on to information technology, into material sciences, into so many things. If you use a touchscreen today, there's a high chance that the touchscreen technology actually is from 3M. So this is an interesting story that's very, very relevant for Perth, because Perth has this amazing industry today which is sort of mining centered, or at least energy and mining centered. So what is the future of this industry is a big question right now. So the first dichotomy that I want to present today is really this sort of thought that vertical domains and expertise and growth is one traditional way of looking at it. But diverse, lateral, and radical growth is another sort of paradigm which we should address. And the duality of these 2 things is what creates the amazing combinations that are behind the history of many of these successful world-class products. So I want to present to you also another case. This case is from a project we did for Maersk Line. Maersk Line is a Danish company which actually is the world's largest container shipping company. This is another company that touches our lives in so many different ways, in invisible ways. I'm sure you see the star in different parts wherever you travel. It's a pretty interesting company in the sense that it's based out of Copenhagen in the cold, dark north part of the world, and it orchestrates the single biggest logistics project ever. And this company has a fascinating history too. But the interesting thing is, a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, Maersk Line came to us and they said, we want to be the most reliable container shipping company in the world. How do we go around doing that? So they basically asked us to work on an interesting project called the Ontime delivery leap. And this is where an interesting saga started, where we started exploring the container shipping industry, but also we didn't just look at the container shipping business, we looked at all kinds of parallel industries that have similarities to this container industry. That includes organ transplantation, flower and book delivery, food networks and sort of catering businesses. We looked at metro systems. We looked at all kinds of areas where synchronization, reliability, and timing was all the business ethics that were driving these amazing successes. And from that, we learned about what synchronized culture really means. So what we did was we actually started interviewing both internal and external stakeholders in different parts of the world, and what they call as the liner operation centers, the LOCs. And we started looking at everyone from a crane operator all the way to the senior executives spread all around the world. But also we interviewed suppliers and sub-suppliers, and this qualitative study combined with their data sets actually started yielding something really fascinating. And we started emerging an interesting trend, which was more about looking at how the future of the container shipping business is going to evolve, rather than looking how to perfect the current industry the way it is known today. So I want to share with you a little software visualization that we did for Maersk Line. And this is interesting because this reflects Maersk's annual container throughput in a visual way for the first time for an entire year. So this is for the year 2010. So if you look at the sort of container traffic pattern, you can start seeing interesting global trends in this as to how goods and services actually move around the world. And this is not possible based on just data. It's actually deep insights combined with data created in different kind of software visualizations that allow this kind of output. But this was deeply insightful because it allowed the company to actually map where the growth patterns are, where the bottlenecks are, and how and what kind of innovation would make a difference to this company in different ways. And yesterday there were a lot of discussion around culture and the sort of differences that are there in the zone. And this is an interesting story here because there were lots of cultural issues that were actually influencing this sort of container traffic pattern. And I want to share with you one small story from there. So this is another rendering of that same sort of container traffic, but this time color coded by how punctual they were. So whether they were on time, delayed. So the red lines represent delays, the green lines represent on time, and the blue lines represents before time. And you would wonder, how is it possible that things are going before time? So this is where culture starts playing a big role, because this is the same in sort of the paradoxes that culture, timing, and synchronous activity actually influence each other. So in this part of the world, in Western Africa, there's an interesting story. There was a lot of vessels that were extremely late, and there was a lot of vessels that were before time, but not many containers were on time. And we were really puzzled as to what was going on there. So we started taking a deeper look into this, and we discovered something really interesting, that culturally it was totally acceptable to move the goalpost if you couldn't achieve what you wanted to achieve on time. So that means that if a vessel or ship was delayed by more than a certain amount of time, they actually moved the schedule and deferred the whole thing so that it was on time. And no one knew this because if you look at the numbers, it didn't say this. But if you start looking at the patterns, you can start seeing how culture actually influences all this. And this is a big lesson, I think, because that's the same in the zone too. There are so many heterogeneous, various cultures, different kinds of mindsets and approaches. And how do you synchronize all this? How do you learn and adapt from this? And how do you design systems that allow this kind of a thought process to be embedded without affecting performance? So what we did was we started developing dashboarding solutions and different kinds of visual representations for this global orchestra that was going on. And this changed the whole business. It changed the business from just being a company that was about moving containers from point A to point B to actually predicting global patterns. For example, just before Christmas, there's a huge amount of empty containers that needs to be moved from the western part of the world to the manufacturing part of the world, that is mostly Shenzhen and Hong Kong and Shanghai. And then these empty containers get stuffed and they moved all the way back typically to the US and Rotterdam. And this is a global pattern, and you have to have predictive analytics and sort of smartness and intelligence in the networks more than in just pure logistics. So The dichotomy that I want to present in that context, especially for Perth today, is that knowledge networks and cultures are as important as resources, geography, and expertise. Yeah. And this is a pretty critical thing because right now there's a lot of thought around resource development, the geographic advantage, the time zone advantage, and the expertise model around this industry here. But the real future for this sort of domain in my head is really the idea that it's all about the networks and cultures. It's really about how do you harness this sort of amazing networks and how do you create synchronized systems, how do you allow people to interact better and in different ways. The other story I want to talk to you about today is this interesting project, a research project we run called Frugal Digital. It's really sort of an approach or a new mindset that we want to bring along on understanding how to reduce resource consumption and optimize systems and design products and services that are localized and are sort of designed bottom up rather than top down. So I want to share an anecdote with you. A couple of years ago, my wife and I were walking through the streets of Mumbai, and on one of the back streets we noticed this pileup of computer monitors, and we were really wondering, what is this about? What's the story behind these computer monitors? And what we discovered there was that some bank, some large multinational bank, had thrown away these old CRT monitors, and these amazing resourceful people in these little back streets, they actually stripped these computer monitors of most of its components and refurbished them to become televisions. So they modified these really old anarchic computer things into a new purpose and a new meaning at low cost. And they sort of retrofitted this and sort of converted a condemned product into a low cost, high resource item for a different kind of audience in a different geography. This was fascinating. So we started understanding and we started investigating this, and we're wondering, is this a local phenomena that's happening in one corner of Mumbai, or is it much bigger? And along the way we actually studied 6 different countries, mostly developing countries, and we were really amazed to see similar patterns in so many different industries happening all over again and again. And this is an interesting sort of trigger point for us because there's an entire industry of kits and suppliers and organic sort of industry around this space that is made up of small vendors and mom and pop shops, and it's really not knitted together by any kind of government or any kind of large corporation anywhere. It's all ad hoc. And this ad hoc business was a giant industry. It wasn't a trivial thing as I was thinking it was. So we even try to understand the logistics that were happening behind this industry. These televisions were actually packaged and sold to rural markets in really unusual ways with a warranty, yeah, of course, because it could be fixed anywhere. And the reason why the televisions weren't distributed through any kind of DHL-like or FedEx-like distribution logistics system which was centralized was that it was too expensive. So it was piggybacking on sort of passenger buses that had excess capacity either on the roofs or in the back seats of the bus. So any extra space in the bus was usually packed with these kinds of things and sold into like small villages around rural India. So this industry actually inspired us into investigating this local tinkering talent, and this local tinkering talent we harnessed to create products in a very different kind of paradigm. Instead of being centrally manufactured and researched in large labs, we actually started creating products that were made locally with simple components that were available as scrap or readily available inexpensive things. So we designed a low-cost projector for schools in rural India based on simple things like a cell phone, a small projector module, a flashlight, and some cheap computer speakers. And we could put together almost a close to €100 solution for schools that were running off a USB key and car batteries. We took an alarm clock, a cheap, inexpensive alarm clock, and converted it into a medical screening tool. And today this product can do multiple things, like it can read blood pressure, heart rate, oxygen saturation, a whole bunch of parameters for less than $2. And this product can actually transform the way rural healthcare and logistics around rural healthcare operates in places like India. We also have done extensions of mobile phones in new ways that allow like medical screening and diagnostics to happen. This is an interesting product we made around hearing loss. We took standard components, off-the-shelf components, reconfigured them, wrote some clever software behind it, and sort of created a diagnostics tool. So this sort of paradigm is another kind of dichotomy that I want to present today to this context, because there's an emergent, ad hoc, self-organizing sort of innovation space which is not systemic, which is not centrally organized, it's not done by large companies or governments, but happening bottom-up in grassroots levels. So what is it that we can learn from there, and how does this make a difference? Because as we rightly mentioned yesterday, a big part of the population that lives in the zone today doesn't have enough purchasing power and access to resources. So how does this sort of innovation paradigm actually make a difference in that space is an interesting question. And I hope that these kinds of research would also lead to more and more of sort of lateral thinking and bring in product innovation from a different point of view completely. The last thing I want to show you today is a research study that we did for the Danish government on innovation hotbeds and sort of creative clusters. We did an interesting study in Denmark and in 6 different other global locations, including the US, Europe, and many parts of Asia, on understanding what drives creativity in certain parts and what is the sort of impetus or what's the drivers behind innovation in certain places. And why is it that there are clusters in the world that are emerging in that space? So this is an interesting visualization from Denmark around the design activity. There's a lot of companies around Copenhagen which are very design focused and sort of bring in design and innovation together for large global companies in different ways. And instead of looking at traditional data and clusters, we started mapping what was going on in the industry. This report is yet to be published, but I want to share with you some of the insights from these things. We discovered that even though companies were starting off thinking that they would do something, over time, very quickly they evolved into something else. That is, the founders of the company actually changed track along the way, and they sort of identified themselves with a new kind of cluster or a new kind of activity, and they started thinking freely. And this created something really interesting, reorganizations of the value systems of companies and the reorganization of talent pools in different ways actually created more growth and more innovation than traditional companies in vertical silos. The other thing that we discovered was that modern creative industries are not single-mindedly focused on one kind of domain. There's a highly cross-disciplinary thinking going on where there was a lot of influences from different places, and there was a lot of cross-thinking and crossover of people, talent, and resources that were happening. And we actually used data from the Danish company registries, but also from LinkedIn and on Facebook, and we sort of created these mashups of different kinds of visualizations that allowed us to see patterns around growth and creativity in a totally new way. But what was the biggest learning from this report and the study was something quite remarkable, and that's very relevant, I think, to this part of the world also. So we realized that there are 3 catalysts, and Jon Rosted, who was one of the economists and senior bureaucrats in the Danish government, he came up with this interesting theory that there are 3 kinds of catalysts required for any kind of innovation hotbed to happen. And the first one is the notion of deal makers, or people who are having excellent business acumen but also have brilliant connections all over the world and can sort of see how these connects happen and how things can be brought together in new ways. So you need deal makers in the first place. The next thing he said was you need supernodes, people who have large vision, who are domain experts, and who have good connections. They may or may not necessarily be business people or people with money, but they have intellectual capability in different ways and can bring in a new kind of value. The last thing he said, you need angel investors who believe in recycling capital in local economies. So this is particularly relevant for all the big companies here, especially to how you want to re-inject your surpluses in different ways in new formats, allows sort of this kind of entrepreneurial activity to sort of flourish in its own environment. But most importantly, it's not about just a cluster, because the notion of clusters has been there for a long time. It's really a new paradigm, and the paradigm is really about ecosystems. So the last dichotomy I want to leave behind today is the idea or the notion of ecosystems, incentives, and sort of creating self-employment in new ways, rather than thinking clusters, subsidies, and government support and employment. because that was an old paradigm which is slowly dissolving away into this kind of a new paradigm, and we can see huge examples of those things happen all over the world. And I believe that this part of the world is also totally ready for it. It's just a matter of reorganization in new ways. So my thoughts, my trailing thoughts on this end is that I think developing competences, especially new competences that are IP based, but not based on new industries, but actually on byproducts which are of a traditional industry. For example, the mining industry has a huge amount of byproducts, and the intellectual byproducts are what's really fascinating. And how can you capitalize on that and build a parallel sort of paradigm with that is the really interesting question to ask. Then the other thing is really about how do you extrapolate new kinds of market conditions and new kind of needs and desires in people. And that's why culture becomes a really important role. I don't know if UWA has a cultural anthropology department, but that plays a huge significant role in the future of businesses, because understanding cultures in the zone is going to be imperative to the success of the industry here. As many examples from yesterday, operating in a place like China or India is not the same business as usual. You cannot transpose a product from here into a different kind of market. You have to adapt and fit into that market in a new kind of cultural context. And the last thing is, at least I have seen the evidence of what systematic policy-driven approach can make a huge difference to a local economy. The Danish government puts a lot of emphasis on this, and I think there's also a huge chance that something like that could happen here if the right kind of ecosystem is created that attracts the pool of talent and a new generation of entrepreneurs to automatically come here, rather than creating incentives and subsidies and tax breaks and all that. Because it's really about the environment, and it's really about a different kind of incentive system that's about creating products in new ways. So to finish off, I just want to leave a little sort of thought that I had. I don't know how many of you know the origins of Procter Gamble. P&G is the world's largest FMCG product company. They sell soaps and detergents and toothpaste and whatnot to all over the world. But the interesting story here is that they started in the American Midwest not because they started selling this kind of FMCG segment straight away. The origins of this company is really in the cornfields, where because of excess or too much surplus of agricultural produce, there was a huge meat industry around pigs. And the swine industry basically produced a byproduct, which is lard. And lard was an important component of making soap at some point in history. And the origins of P&G actually is in that space. There's a funny story in Denmark too, in this space. Same thing, the same story. Cornfields, pigs, meat exports, but instead of lard this time, it was swine insulin. So basically, insulin is a hormone that sort of controls metabolism in your body. And Novo Nordisk or Novo Labs at that point in 1930 actually discovered how to isolate insulin from pigs and use it safely in humans. And that was a huge paradigm shift at that point. And that drove Novo Nordisk, which is one of the global sort of suppliers of insulin and diabetes care today. And Novo Nordisk is a critical component of the ecosystem, especially the creative and technology, biotechnology ecosystem of Denmark today. Many companies owe their success to Novo Nordisk today, and it's the same story there. So a certain natural resource, a byproduct of the natural resource industry, and that byproduct transformed into a different kind of paradigm, a different kind of market, addressing a new kind of consumer need. So the real question for this part of the world is minerals. There's the mining industry, there's the intellectual byproducts that are coming out of that. So what next after this? Thanks so much for your time.